Hello and welcome to the ninth video that I'll be posting in my Unity platformer tutorial series. And in today's video, we'll be discussing about the player's jump movement. And what we're gonna do in today's video is we're gonna make a sorting layer. There's actually two types of layers, and that's this layer found on top and the sorting layer in our renderer. And the sorting layer is almost found in every renderer. So they will have the same sorting layer, and that's always found in all of the renderers. Okay, we got sprite render, they're gonna use that too. Tilemap render, they're gonna use that too, and almost any other renderer we have in Unity will use this sorting layer. But you can find this sorting layer is actually you go to additional settings, and if you click it, you find a sorting layer. And sorting layer is used in order to help the system to identify which layers are going to be initialized first or rendered first. So in order to add sorting layers, you can click on sorting layer default. You're going to go to the add sorting layer section, and you're going to be brought to like an inspector view of layers. And in a sorting layer, we can click on the plus button here, and we can type in our new layer. So I'm going to type in background first, because background will be the first to be drawn or rendered. And then on top of that, we're gonna have the foreground, because foreground will be rendered afterwards. And then we need a entity, which is enemies, right? We're gonna have enemies in our platformer. And we have our player, because player will be in front of everything. And the way this works is the higher you are in the level of layers, the first layer that's gonna be rendered by the system is that layer. And the last is the player layer. The player layer. And the player layer main purpose is to actually allow the player sprite to be in front of everything. So basically, higher you put the layer, then the layer above it will cover it up. So let's just say if I just change player to be below entity, entity will be in front of layer, in front of the player. So every time I move the player near a layer that's using entity, then the player will be seen behind it. However, if we put the player on top, in the bottom, then player will always be in front of the entity, and the entity will be behind it. So once you've made the sorting layer, what you're gonna do is you're gonna click back to any of the sprites that you have renderer on and just select it. So for player, we're gonna select sorting layer player. For background, we're gonna select our sorting layer background, and for foreground, we're gonna set it to foreground 2, foreground, and that's it. Entity, we don't have any yet, and we will be adding those as the series continues. So what I'm gonna do now is we're gonna go to scripts, open up the Visual Studio, and actually start adding the code for the jump. So, like always, we're gonna go to our scripts folder, click on the player controller script, and open Visual Studios. So now what I'm going to do is create a method for our jump, and it's gonna be called jump method. So what we're gonna do is, okay, wait, instead of me showing you right now, I'm going to ask you guys to do this challenge, which is to create a method called jump method, and just add curly brackets, and you don't need to put anything inside of it. Okay, so pause the video right now and create a method called jump method with curly brackets, and that's it. You don't need to do anything else. Okay, so for those of you who have succeeded the challenge, good job. For those of you who haven't, it's fine. So what you're gonna do is actually really simple, and you're gonna type in the keyword void, okay, and the name, which is jump method. Doesn't have to be jump method, but then I want to keep things clear, so I'm gonna name it jump method, and then we're gonna click enter and add our curly brackets by clicking shift curly bracket, enter again, and we have our paragraph form where all our code is executed. And what I'm going to do, instead of adding force in our player RB, such as so in the line 31, I'm going to use velocity, because when we jump, there is gravity affecting on us. And instead of adding force, which is directly like no motion at all, no build up, I'm going to use another code or another form of player RB, and that's velocity. So code will go something like this: player RB dot velocity, because we want to make sure that our jump is affected by gravity too. And then when it comes to velocity here, and we want to transform our player to positions, we can use equals to new vector 2. So for 3D objects, of course, we're going to use vector 3, but I won't be discussing much about that because we are, after all, in the 2D world. So vector 2, and then we're going to put in the brackets. And as you see, my Visual Studio is recommending me two ways. You can either put in vector 2 brackets or vector 2 with float x and float y. So when we jump, I want the player position to be the player position, of course. So at player RB dot velocity dot x. So the player x position won't change. Meanwhile, for our y, I want us to move upwards a little bit. But let's just say I just want to move 20. But then I don't want it to be 20, okay? I want it to be something that we can identify or edit in our inspector really easily. So to do that, we can just make a variable. If I drag here top and name this public int, let's just say what's a good name? Jump force. Okay, and then we go back down here and just say jump force. We can actually edit that value in our inspector. However, the main problem of just using jump force is that we need an absolute value because we don't want anything to change. I don't want any miscalculations or any problems when it counts our velocity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in a code called mathf. This is how the computer identifies almost all the math happening. Mathf. I'm going to make sure that the value of our jump force is absolute number. So that means it cannot be a value that's not absolute. And then in the jump force, and then I'm just going to put the end brackets to mark the vector 2 here at the end. And then, as you always know, end with a semicolon. Now we're done with the jump method, right? However, it's not called by anything. We could put this like this. We could put in our void update. But then, wouldn't that make the system break or the game? Because there's no if statement here. And it says it will update once per frame. So we're basically saying the player to continuously jump without any control. And that's not good. We don't want it to be that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call our jump method inside of here. Jump method inside of our player movement. However, I'm going to add an if statement so that we can control, or the player, when playing our game, control the jump. So in order to do this, we can simply use the if statement, and that's if, okay? And instead of using the horizontal direction like this, input.getAxis, we're going to use that similar tactic. However, since if we go to project settings and we're going to go to our input manager, we can see that the jump is not an axis, it's a button. Where's the jump here? There's a jump here. So what I'm going to do is if input get button down. Okay, that means it will only activate once the button is down. And I'm gonna call this a string button name. And in our input manager, we can see that jump here is the name jump. So let's say get mouse down, jump, and then we're gonna make sure that we add the curly bracket here so that our jump method can be called. Oh wait. Second. Okay. And now we should end always with a semicolon, as you know. Now, if we go back to Unity, we close this input manager screen, and let's just say jump force is 10. Let's just say 5. And then we click play, and then we're gonna click the jump button. And as you can see, I can even click the jump button while the player is in the air. and that's not good. So in order to fix that, we need to add another, or make this if statement more specific. And we can do that by using our logical operator. And the one that I want to use specifically is the AND, because we want to make it more specific. Not only this variable must be true, but this must also be true. And what I want is to make sure that the player will only, once colliding with the ground, or so-called ground, will be able to jump, but then in the air it cannot jump. And to do so, we're gonna make a new variable, a new inspector variable, and that's gonna be called a public layer mask, and I'm gonna call this ground. Okay. So a layer mask is essentially a layer, but then we want to assign it to a variable. So we're making sure that a layer mask is basically a layer that I just want to make it into a variable so we can control it with our collision. Okay. Now create also another inspector variable called private. And since our player is using a box collider and we want it to collide with the ground, and when it comes to collision, all you need to do is find your collider. Okay, so box collider 2D, and I'm gonna name this player call for short, and with a semicolon as always. And in our void start, I'm gonna do what I did similar to our rigid body. I'm gonna initialize our player collision with get component, and we want to get our box collider 2D, and with a bracket here at the end, and then semicolon. And now the system knows which inspector is the player collision dealing with, and that's our box collider 2D. Now if we go down to our AND, I'm going to add a code, and that's player collision must be what? Touching the ground, right? We want to touch the ground. So is touching layer, is touching layers. Is touching, says my Visual Studio, is whether it's touching with another collider, or it says is touching layers, which is touching layers and then one overload. So we're just gonna go with layers because we don't have another collider, right? Is touching layers, brackets this, and then we get two options: is touching layer and is touching an int layer mask. And luckily we've made that layer mask on top, and it's called ground. So we can just type in here ground and end with a bracket to close our if statement here, and then we're done with that. And if we go back to Unity now, we can see that the player controller is asking for the ground. And if we click here, we can see that it's actually referring to our layer on top here. So now we can go and click on our foreground, because foreground is our ground in the game. Remember that everything we drawn is in the foreground. So now if I click play, and let's just say I want to jump multiple times here, I can only jump when I'm touching the ground. So I try smashing my spacebar here. I think you guys can listen to that. And I can't jump when I'm in the ground. I can only jump once I touch the ground. And this is true because our input get button down jump is true. However, our player collision is not touching the layer. It's not touching the layer mask ground, which we assign that to our foreground layer. And our foreground is in the layer foreground. So basically, the system knows that this is true. Okay, I've been smashing my spacebar, and this is not true. And in the previous video, I've mentioned that when we're using an if and statement, both of them must be true. So that's why this can only happen when this is true and I'm clicking jump button, and this is saying that I have to touch the layer ground, which is our foreground. And foreground layer is connected to foreground, and everything we draw in foreground is now basically meaning that it's touching this layer, this foreground tile set. Okay, now let's review everything, okay? So we've added a new type of inspector variables, and that's our box collider 2D, because when we want to make sure when a player collides with something, we're gonna talk about its collider. When we want to add force, we're using rigid body, okay? And layer mask is another inspector variable, and this layer mask is basically making sure we want to take a layer from the top, and we're gonna make it into a variable so that we can program it. Okay, so that's layer mask. It's just taking a layer from the top here and then making it into a variable, and in the variable we can compare it with the collisions and colliders. And then we've added our jump method, so that's how you make a method. We're going to use something called velocity here. Dot velocity equals to new vector 2, and this new vector 2 here means the new position, and I did not want to change anything with the x. I just want to change the y, and I want to make sure that the y value of the jump force is absolute numbers, and we can do that by using mathf.absolute. And then we go back to our player movement, and we've added this code for input get button down jump, which is for the spacebar, and player collision is touching the ground, which is our layer mask that we've created from the top, and it's touching that layer. Then we can use this, and then we call out our jump method, which is to jump. In the next video, I'll be discussing about changing the axis of the player so that we can see its face changing. And I think that's it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope this helped you a lot about Unity platformer making, and I'll see you in the next video.